we really would like to aim to foster much more resilience and much more sustainable livelihood in the world, most vulnerable regions. And those zones in conflict and also in post-conflict zone are some of the most vulnerable regions and communities we work for.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Today's episode is the launch of a new series called From Fragility to Stability, in which we examine what works to improve the well-being of people in fragile and conflict-affected settings who often struggle to sustain resilient food, land, and water systems in the face of the climate crisis. The series is produced with CGIAR, a global partnership that unites international organizations engaged in research about food security to help deepen understanding of fragility, conflict, and migration dynamics. Episodes in this series will convene experts, practitioners, policymakers, and stakeholders to foster a collaborative dialogue, share insights, and co-create actionable strategies to address the multifaceted challenges of conflict, crises, and fragility. To kick off this series, we have a high-powered panel discussion focusing on how partnerships can bring food systems from fragility to stability. You will hear from Ismahane Elouafi, Executive Managing Director of CGIAR, Andrew Harper, Special Advisor to the High Commissioner on Climate Action at the UN Refugee Agency, Arif Hussain, Chief Economist and Director of Analysis, Planning and Performance at the World Food Programme, and Katrina Kosick, Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, lead CGIAR Research Initiative on Fragility, Conflict, and Migration, and lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. To learn more and access other episodes in this series, please visit globaldispatches.org or click the link in the show notes of this episode. And now here's our conversation. Thank you all for being here. I'm excited for our conversation today.
It's great to be here, Mark.
Yes.
Thank you for hosting us.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Ismahan, can I just have you say your name and your title?
Ismahane Elouafi, the Executive Managing Director of the CGIAR.
And Arif.
My name is Arif Hussain. I'm Chief Economist for the World Food Programme.
And Katrina.
Yes, I'm Katrina Kosick. I am a Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute and lead of the CGIAR Research Initiative on Fragility, Conflict, and Migration.
And Andrew.
I'm Andrew Harper. I'm the Special Advisor to the High Commissioner for Refugees on Climate Action.
Starting with Ismahan, what do you see as some of the largest challenges confronting fragile and conflict-affected food systems, and what are the roles of evidence and science in addressing them?
It is quite an interesting time right now when we are speaking, whereby really when we talk about conflict, we see it surging all over the world. So it's a time in history where really most of the agreement that we put in place after World War II are being dismantled. So for me, if I look at the main challenges that we have in front of us today, I see really it's people to be human. We are losing our humanity. We are losing our common values, or we are disagreeing around those. And I think really that's creating more and more conflict and more disagreement and more discontentment as well. Beyond that, I think the other big challenge that I see today, so other than we are unable to agree on things and we are unable to bring multi-stakeholder, multi-voices, multi-religion, multi-races agreement to agree on something. I think the second one, and that is related to all of this, it's really the earth biologically is changing. It's climate change. So the planet per se is warming up, and that planet, by warming up, many species within the planet are changing, the interactions are changing, and this is a huge issue in terms of food security. So by the fact to know that today the same seed, if we plant a seed today versus we planted 30 years, it's producing less food and less nutrient. It's very worrying. If you put a projection in 20 years, you're going to find the same seed again will produce less. So we're a growing population that needs more food, not less food, and particularly more nutrient, not less nutrient. But the climate change is a reality that's going to make food security and nutrition security a bigger challenge every month more, every season more, and every year much more. And what's the role of evidence and science? And I think when we talk about uncertainty, when we talk about climate change, and when we talk about variability, so that's where you need really evidence based. You need data, you need innovation, you need information so that you are taking the right decision. And within that, really, CGIAR plays a very critical role by developing innovation and by providing research driven solution. And those will be very important to really for fragile and conflict affected settings. So, for example, drought resistant crops will be more and more needed as the planet heats up and as crops requires more water or requires water and there is a lot of spell of drought. Sustainable agricultural practices as we need to produce, but in the same time really remediate what happens to the ecosystem. We need also evidence on which policies and programming and intervention can help address poverty and promote resilience. So which program, which safety net is the best one and will give you the better return on investment. And of course, we work across the three phases of the crisis and the conflict, the prevent, the respond, and the rebuild. We look first at how to prevent and mitigate the effect of crisis, particularly when it is due to nature or to climate change, how to respond effectively to them, and finally, at how to rebuild and promote resilience after the fact. And I think really we could do much more in those settings. And that's where science and data can definitely help identify which innovations, which policies, which programs work best in conflict setting, and how to implement them effectively. This will guide the policy decision, ensure that government and donors invest in the long-term solution to food security and peace building. I can give you one example, which is the CGIAR working in partnership with UNHCR to provide evidence, data, and insight to mitigate the vulnerability of 110 million refugees that are displaced people and their hosts, and to inform policies. And their CGIAR helped develop UNCGR new strategic plan for climate action. And all of this really, if you don't have enough data, you can't really intervene. So data and quality of data is very important, and good understanding of the situation and the ecosystem and what can be produced and what shouldn't be produced in those areas.
Andrew, same question to you.
We seem to be facing more and more challenges as conflicts arise almost on a daily basis, and the conflicts that are arising are not being resolved. And so we're seeing more and more of the world in conflict, and that's obviously having an impact on displacement. And where we thought people may have been able to return home, return back to their communities in the past, it's just not happening. And I think at the moment there's something like 70% of the world's displaced are actually coming from countries that are impacted particularly by the climate crisis. So when we talk about climate, there's no sort of like direct correlation to conflict, but where we see that being played out is on the impact of food security, on access to water, on widening the grievances between communities. The largest challenge that we're seeing is that peace is not being recognized for what it is, it's not being preserved, it's not being reinforced. And so as a consequence, we are seeing more and more challenges. And those challenges are being compounded by the climate crisis. And as we're talking about food security, that's probably one of the key drivers of tension, of conflict, of violence, and of displacement. And so when we talk about the importance of science and data, it's not only trying to ensure that current displaced populations and the host communities around them, whether that be in Uganda or Kenya or in Bangladesh, have the data and the means to anticipate what future shocks will be on their livelihoods. It's also about trying to anticipate where future vulnerabilities will take place in the future. The crops of 30 years ago are not producing what's required now. This sort of accelerated impacts of climate change is even going to be more challenging. We've been looking with CGIAR and other academic institutes and research institutes to see what will heat stress be like, not only on populations that are currently displaced, but we're also seeing what will that heat stress be like on the livelihoods which they depend on. Will maize grow in the areas where it's currently grown? Will cattle or even poultry be able to survive in the future? So across the board, we need to not only understand the current impact of climate crisis and the challenges that has on food security, but we need to be able to anticipate what future challenges will be. And also, we can't just look at this in isolation. If you look at the Sahel or if you look in other parts of Africa, you've got populations that are going to double in the next 20, 25 years. So if you see a reduction in food security, a reduction in predictable rainfall, and a doubling of the population, we need to start preparing and supporting the adaptation of those communities now. So science and data is absolutely critical for us to be able to plan and put in the place the necessary policies that are required.
And Arif, same question to you. What do you see as some of the largest challenges confronting fragile and conflict-affected food systems, and what are the roles of evidence and science in addressing them?
Starting out, what we have to realize is that just in the last 4 years, the number of people who are experiencing crisis or worse level of food insecurity has more than doubled, meaning from 135 million in 2019 to about slightly more than 300 million today. This is beyond sobering. And the reason why, because of essentially three things. The biggest, which we are seeing all over the place, conflicts, climate shocks, and then economic crises. Unfortunately, most places where we work, it's not one or the other. It is usually at least two, if not three altogether. And I think this is probably one of the biggest reasons which is impacting food systems around the world. Now, to make the situation even more terrible, what we are seeing is obviously rising needs, but at the same time, the monies needed to address those needs are going down. In fact, right now, our needs have doubled and our funding is still at the level of 2019. You can imagine the gap. Now, the problem with this gap is also that, if it was just one organization which was being cut or something like that, it would be manageable, right? But if everybody is being cut, whether it's in the UN, the different agencies, whether it is NGOs, whether it's even governments, I mean, it's a really, really, really tough time to be dependent on humanitarian assistance. And frankly, there are millions upon millions of people who are in that state. That's really the state of affairs which we are talking about. Now, coming to the role of science and evidence, I mean, it is critical in terms of addressing these complex issues, challenges. We'll give you a few examples. I mean, for us, one thing I'd like to say is that there is no place to hide. Meaning, if you cannot put people in a place, you can put your cell phones. If you cannot put your cell phones, you can put your satellites. One way or the other, you can get information. That is positive in the sense of knowing what is going on and how to target people to address their issues. But it is also positive in the sense of you have to do something if you know about it. So ignorance is no longer an excuse. So using these technologies, we know what is happening. And if we know, then we must address that as humanity. And I think this is a message which people need to understand, that we can no longer say, Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. If I had known, we would have done something about it. Well, you know, so what are you going to do about it? That is the big question for the humanitarians as we go forward. Now, in addition to that, frankly, staying on the same lines, I mean, we have ability to see food security monitoring. We can do food security monitoring in real time in any place. We can also, through those technologies and innovations, see the impact of our interventions. And this 20 years ago was not possible. Today it is. That is the value of science. Also, looking at things like what we do operationally speaking. Now we have evidence in the sense of what works better. Should we give people cash because it's fungible, because they can use for different things as they see fit? Should we give people vouchers if we want to support the markets, if we want to hedge people from inflation? Or should we just give pure in kind? And what are the trade offs in these things? And science allows us to answer some of these questions in a way which is practical and which is applicable.
Katrina, over to you.
I really appreciate how my colleagues have highlighted how food systems are facing conflicts and crises, but they're simultaneously facing just a myriad of challenges. There's climate shocks, but at the same time, we have political instability and weak institutions. You have social dynamics that are really disrupted by displacement, by violent extremism, by a broad lack of social cohesion. And these are just compounded with economic turmoil. So seeing these compound crises it's becoming the new normal, and it really demands urgent responses. We know that these dynamics are fueling poverty, as my colleagues have said, but they're also further weakening governance. They're further eroding gender equality and social inclusion. So you get these negative feedback loops that can destabilize food systems even more. And I really want to zoom in here a bit on the governance and the gender equality aspects. If we consider governance, we know that fragility and conflict are creating unique governance challenges. These exacerbate food insecurity, particularly if you look at, for example, the breakdown of institutions that are responsible for distributing resources or for managing agricultural systems. These breakdowns are causing systems to fail. They do not deliver what they are meant to deliver. They do not allow efficient functioning of the food system. And there are a few things that we know can make things better. Coordination among different government ministries, for one, those ministries addressing shocks and crises, those that are combating poverty, is really essential for any of those ministries to effectively and efficiently function, to avoid duplication or gaps in delivery on a poverty reduction objective. But then even beyond national governments, we also know that there's a need for improved global governance. For example, if you look within global governance structures, there's at the moment really a need for a more robust peace-building approach, a stronger conflict resolution mechanism. And this sort of peace-building into our humanitarian and development objectives is what the humanitarian development peace nexus approach is about. We can have an effort to address the worst impacts of crises, but we can simultaneously bring about long-term and sustainable development as well as peace. So bringing these all together into a common and shared objective, given how many synergies they have amongst themselves, is really critical. But then, I've zoomed out a bit here, but also engaging local leaders is critical. Local leaders are often an untapped source of information about who are the most vulnerable or how best to reach those people. And they can play a role in determining how humanitarian aid and food assistance are distributed, or how to really maximize their benefits while minimizing the costs of distributing them. So finding these effective ways to promote inclusive governance is important. And one last point I want to make about that is that when you have transparent and accountable governance, it tends to result in trust and cohesion that can avoid future conflict. So again, sort of nipping in the bud these vicious cycles in which governance problems tend to give rise to additional and future governance challenges. And then quickly turning to the issues of gender and social inclusion, gender dynamics are so often overlooked amid crises, but they're so central to effective solutions. We know that women are disproportionately harmed by crises. And this comes about because there are structural and normative barriers that limit women's resilience It limits their ability to respond effectively. So more so than for men, we see that when a shock arises, women's food and dietary diversity, their access to food, their dietary diversity go down. Their decision-making power within the household erodes. Their assets are the first assets that are sold off. They're losing access to critical services like healthcare. And we see rises in gender-based violence, this decline in physical safety. And so we know where this comes from. These vulnerabilities stem from women's already limited access to resources, to technologies, to services. But then these are intensified by the shocks and crises. And we also know that women lack access to channels of power and influence that could, in theory, help them benefit from crisis response policies and programming. So we see sort of a vulnerability along with a disproportionate inability to benefit from the responses to the crises. So involving women in decision-making and training and supporting female farmers, ensuring that aid programs are actually in their design influenced by women, but that also that they can reach and benefit those women are key strategies for creating resilient food systems in fragile settings.
So, Arif, with the rise in conflicts and climate shocks, what evidence and strategies is the World Food Program finding most effective to promote food security in fragile settings?
I think the main thing here is that if we really truly want to improve the food security situation of the world and under the current circumstances, 5 things must happen. First and foremost, we need to meet urgent needs. That should be our laser sharp focus. People in trouble, we need to help save their lives. That's first and foremost. Second, we need to invest in building human capital. That means education and nutrition. Third, we need to build the resilience of communities so they can deal with shocks on their own. Fourth, we need to realize that we are outsiders. So if we want to support these communities, we need to support their systems and their frameworks. And fifth, if we can help ourselves, meaning providing services like flying UNHAS and others, we can help our partners too. And if we do these 5 things while taking care of gender, while taking care of nutrition, while taking care of environment, and while staying accountable to our beneficiaries, we got a model. And in order to do that, there are certain things which are needed. People, first and foremost, money, technology, evidence, and above all, partnerships. Partnerships at the community level, at the country level, at the regional level, and at the national level. I think that's what we need to address what is happening right now in the world.
So, Ismahan, the third element of the model that Arif just articulated was around building resilience. I wanted to ask you, how are CGIAR science innovations as well as CGIAR policy recommendations helping to do just that, to enhance resilience in fragile and conflict-affected settings?
I think, Mark, one example is developing climate resilient crops, for example. So if you have a drought tolerant maize or if you have a flood resistant rice, it will have farmers to continue to produce food under extreme condition common in most of those conflict prone regions. We do also focus quite a lot on sustainable agricultural practices. The time in the 60s and 70s where we needed to produce more to just stop famine is gone. So now we need really to produce more with less, and we need to do that particularly in the conflict zone. As we know, most of the refugees are not there for 1 or 2 weeks. They are there for a few months, if not years. And I think what we are doing as CGIAR with our partners, it's also help design and evaluate programs that are specially suited for these unique challenges, keeping resilience. And resilience, as I think Arif said, it's really bouncing back. How could these people in those situations really bounce back and be better? There's one example from Nigeria where we are studying the effect of subsidies for specially designed bundles of agricultural input among the IDPs. And we are analyzing how local governments can contribute to more effective anticipatory action programming in Mali. With Dr. Hussein, we are collaborating with WFP on a co-designed portfolio for about 30 projects that are spanning 13 countries to inform WFP programming on disaster risk financing, sustainable school meals and clean cooking, and smallholder farmers' production and livelihood resilience. The policy side is also very important. So it's not only technologies, it's not only programming, it's also policy recommendation that are very important for all these projects. So we work with government and international organizations to build policies that support smallholder farmers, ensure fair distribution of resources, and restore degraded landscape. So in a nutshell, Mark, it's either really innovation, like really drought resistant animals or fish or plant, but also through the right policies or through the right programming and the right programs that we make sure give us the biggest return on investment in those populations.
And Andrew and Katrina, I wanted to turn to you with some questions about climate and conflict-induced displacement. So, Andrew, I would imagine coming from the UN Refugee Agency, you're constantly observing how climate change is shaping patterns of forced displacement. What types of evidence and data is needed for your programming to support the livelihoods and climate resilience of those forcibly displaced?
Firstly, there's probably 70% of the world's population are coming from countries that are being impacted by climate change. And while there's you can't sort of say there's a direct attribution climate change to displacement, we can say that there is increasing evidence that climate change is aggravating the underlying reasons or the root causes for displacement. And so if you look at the situation of the 10 million people who have been displaced in South Sudan, almost 1 million have now gone to Chad. And Chad is rated as one of the most climate vulnerable states in the world. I think it is rated as the most climate vulnerable state in the world. And so these populations are unlikely to go back anytime soon. So we have to start looking at how will they survive in the future. A humanitarian response is not going to be adequate for dealing with the climate crisis. We need to engage and invest in development and adaptation, and as we say, resilience, all these climate buzzwords. But what it means is, how do you keep people alive for decades without a reliance on the international community? And so to do that, we need to base our interventions on evidence, on data, and on science, but also talking to the populations on the ground. And so we've got offices around the world, much like WFP. We've got 500 offices on the ground. So we're talking to populations, we're talking to the communities, but we need to know from CGIAR and others, what should we invest in? Like, what types of crops should people be growing? What types of investment in infrastructure? Does it make sense to invest in an area that may not be habitable in 10 or 15 years? What will be the heat stress? And we all have to recognize that we don't have the answers. And so what we need to do is go to the people who do have maybe not the answers, but at least have a fairly good idea about what the challenges and opportunities are in the future. So CGIAR, excellent in terms of agriculture, on resources. We've also got to talk to people in terms of water, access to aquifers. How do we sort of manage increasingly unpredictable rainfall in the future? So across the board, we need data, we need science to inform us as a protection agency and our partners on what will work in the future. And that will then support us also going to the people who've got the funds. And that includes, for instance, the Green Climate Fund, the World Bank. Just over this last week, I've had discussions using CGIAR data with the Green Climate Fund, with the World Bank. We'll be doing a presentation next week to the expert group at the Security Council. So it's about operationalizing the data and getting it to the people who can make the right decisions.
And Katrina, to you, how is the initiative that you lead, which is focused on fragile and conflict-affected food systems, incorporating migration and displacement in its analysis of possible solutions to fragility and conflict?
Yeah, migration and displacement are really at the heart of our research on fragility and conflict. One important point I want to make is that our researchers are finding and emphasizing that migration is also a really critical, powerful development tool. When people migrate, this can grow their incomes. They acquire education and skills. Often these migrants will then send home remittances that can be invested back at home. And then many return to make new investments in their home communities. So we know there's a very positive side to migration. Even when forced, we know that refugees and displaced populations bring their skills, their labor, their innovation to host communities, and they have a high potential to contribute to local economies if they're properly integrated. But at the same time, we really can't ignore the growing strain that forced migration is placing on fragile food systems that already have concerns about adequate resources in rural areas. Displacement can destabilize food systems. It can increase those pressures on the resources and services in host communities. They're often ill-equipped to absorb large populations. And we also have these social dynamics I mentioned earlier. That you can have social cohesion essentially degrading as you're mixing populations. So our work is emphasizing integration of displaced people in host communities, but it's also analyzing peace itself. And it's considering what are the policies, the programming, the interventions that can work to promote trust and social cohesion. How can migration be transformed into a driver of resilience and growth? Are there ways that migrants can be retained in their origin households by providing them opportunities and promoting peace in those home communities? So our research is really focusing on developing solutions that make food systems more adaptive, more responsive to the needs of both displaced populations and host communities. But we're emphasizing long-term strategies that can integrate migrants into agricultural production, into rural economies more broadly, and allow migrants to contribute to food security and growth. So refugees and displaced people often demonstrate remarkable resilience and innovation when they're empowered with the right resources, and then they can help strengthen food systems rather than weaken them. So the goal here really is to build sustainable, inclusive food systems that not only mitigate the negative impacts of displacement, but also create a foundation for development and resilience in fragile contexts.
So, Katrina, I wanted to stay with you and, in essence, have you respond to something that Andrew mentioned in his earlier remarks, which is how the UN Refugee Agency harnesses CGIAR research in its work, even before he said the Security Council coming up. So can I have you just explain in a bit more detail what roles can research play and evidence-based decision-making play in shaping responses to fragility and conflict?
Well, through the CGIAR research program that I co-lead on fragility, conflict, and migration, we really aim to partner with those that are actively seeking guidance and seeking evidence-based recommendations for addressing all of the complex challenges we've been talking about today. Our partnerships with the World Food Program and with UNHCR are just these really clear examples of this type of collaboration. But also, we have many important partnerships with governments, with NGOs, with local researchers, and getting their know-how and their identification of what are the challenges, what are the answers they're seeking, and the knowledge gaps they want to fill. This is what's driving our work. So we're emphasizing the importance of involving local communities and leaders, as well as local scholars in our research and innovation process in the CGIAR. And their insights are valuable for understanding factors such as the political economy of a local context. Why does a certain policy reform not work when we think in theory it should? And what are these specific nuances about how fragility and conflict manifest in that particular location that can help us understand effective responses for building resilience? So really, by tailoring these analyses to partner needs and ensuring we embed research design in local knowledge, we can support policy decisions and programming that are informed by reliable evidence. We also recognize the need for ongoing monitoring and evaluation of interventions. This is something that Arif mentioned earlier. Evidence-based decision-making isn't just about these initial recommendations. It requires assessing impacts of actions taken, adjusting strategies based on real-world outcomes, and feeding back what we have learned from our studies. Our approach is utilizing a multidisciplinary perspective. It is our firm belief in CGIAR that we need to integrate insights from a variety of disciplines to fully understand such complex topics. So we have economists, sociologists, we have public health, environmental scientists, political scientists, and they're helping us build a comprehensive understanding of the complexities of fragility and conflict. Innovative technologies like remote sensing and big data are allowing our researchers to provide real-time insights into conflict dynamics. They're enabling quicker and more informed decision-making. And our partners explain to us that it plays a crucial advocacy role. It helps them shape narratives and priorities around fragility and conflict that can then influence funding and policy directions for the better. We know the stakes are high in fragile and conflict-affected settings. The risks of getting it wrong are devastating. This results in worsening food insecurity, more displacement, more social instability. But we also know that business as usual solutions do not work in these contexts. And we take this very, very seriously in the CGIAR. We need careful, targeted evidence to design innovative and responsive strategies that adapt to these dynamics on the ground. We want to ensure responses are timely, that they're effective, and be mindful that global challenges like fragility and conflict require coordinated and mindful responses.
So, Arif and Andrew, I have the same question for each of you. And Arif, we'll start with you. How has collaboration with the CGIAR helped your organization bridge that science policy interface that we've been discussing, and in so doing, promote better programming and policies in fragile and conflict-affected settings?
Being in the field, you're looking at problems which are real, which are genuine, and they need answers. So partnering with the organization like CGIAR brings the analytical capacity that we have also, but it amplifies that analytical capacity as well as it brings credibility to what is being presented as on the policy front or on the operational front. Now, for me, basically, working with CGIAR has helped us improve our operations. I gave you examples of cash versus in-kind assistance. There has been several studies on the nutrition side, what is good for children to eat, basically. There have been several studies in terms of building better resilience for communities. And again, this is all applied research. This is all applied work. And then the other thing which is important is that unlike theoretical research, here in applied research, you have answers very, very quickly. And sometimes those answers can defy your expectations. And you have to go back to the drawing board and say, I didn't think of this. How did this happen? And that dynamic research, that dynamic flow of information or knowledge is critical. And this is why our partnerships have lasted. Why? Because they've given the space for that to happen. And they've given the trust for that to happen. So today, if I look at our academic partnerships, I think CGIAR is in the top by far.
Andrew, same question to you.
Our relationship with CGIAR is much younger than with WFP and CGIAR. I think it's been less than 2 years, but we've maxed it out as much as we possibly can. So thanks a million to the team there. And part of that, I think it's a win-win situation. UNHCR as WFP is very operational. We're in the field. We're seeing the impacts of the climate crisis, the food security crisis happen before our eyes. We're seeing it impacting on millions and millions of people. We've got teams in the field who are just desperate to do a better job. We've got donor states who are asking for more evidence and data. And we've got CGIAR, if I can talk on their behalf as well, wanting to see their data and analysis being used for good. And so it is a perfect situation where we're desperate for the data and the science and the analysis and the partnership, and CGIAR want to see their work being used for good. And so in that regards, we're working together in order to create the synergy where we're not only responding to the displacement, but we're just trying to see, okay, how do we mitigate the future impacts of the climate crisis? How do we ensure better food security? How do we ensure better, more dignified protection of populations who we know are going to be made more vulnerable? And as a consequence, and this is again sort of demonstration of collaboration, CGI is actually putting in a couple of staff into our field offices in Africa. And so this adds a huge amount of credibility to what we're doing, because in the past we'd have anecdotes, we'd talk about the numbers of refugees who have crossed the number of people who are in need. But now we can actually anticipate what future shocks and stresses will be on vulnerable populations, which could lead to conflict. And so, as I mentioned before, we're using this data and this information to amplify their results, their data, their analysis to a wider audience and saying, look, we actually need to not only invest in a response to population displacement, but we need to invest in peace. And I was actually talking to some friends in the Kenyan government today, and they were saying peace is like a plant. You need to water it continuously. And so what we're trying to do is not only be a refugee agency, but we're trying to be a refugee prevention agency. How can we be doing much more in order to mitigate the future vulnerabilities that we know that's coming down the line? So an invaluable partnership, a collaboration which I can only be seeing to be getting stronger, and something which I hope that others can also learn from and collaborate with.
So much of our conversation thus far has identified and articulated the need for coordination and collaboration between institutions. So I wanted to dial in a bit more directly on that topic in questions that I'll pose to Ismahan, Arif, and Andrew. And Ismahan, I'll pose it first to you. Given all that you've heard thus far, what is needed for even more successful collaboration between researchers and implementation partners?
So today, if we compare by 50 years, 100 years ago, collaboration and partnership is super important. And a good and successful collaboration always hinges on end-to-end engagement throughout the research process, from the initial discussion to the final implementation. So having really all partners participating at equal footing, it's very important to make sure that inside the practical realities are really integrated into the research design. The second point, it has to be tailored to the ecosystem or the situation we are talking about. So generic research finding might not translate effectively into actionable strategies, especially in fragile and conflict affected settings where the context is different and the stakes are higher. And I think the third point would be effective outreach and communication between the different parties again. And if we look at our programs today, they're much more complex. They're not linear, definitely. It's multi-stakeholder, multidiscipline, multi-areas of intervention, and multi-institutional as well. So a researcher definitely needs to have very strong outreach and communication. We need to take in consideration the science, the technology, the novelty, but also see how it marries with the local knowledge and the indigenous knowledge. The fourth area will be capacity strengthening, which is an essential element. Researchers should not only provide evidence, but also support partners in building their skills and knowledge. And basically, our success, even as CGIAR, is that we have to make sure that the national systems or the community that we are working with is graduating from needing our help. So by the end status of success is that people can do it by themselves, that they have the capacity and the institutions and the resources and the models and the policies and the regulation to do it by themselves. And of course, maybe the two other points I have to address, it's identifying key decision and leverage point within organization that can facilitate the integration of research into practice. The other point, it's addressing evidence gap, because sometimes if we use very weak data or unfinished data or not a complete data, we might take the wrong decision. So we have to identify the gaps, and we should use new technologies and new ways really to bridge that evidence gap. And the last point is fostering a culture of mutual trust and respect between researchers and implementation partners, which is vital. So building strong relationship based on shared goals and understanding can lead to more effective collaboration and better outcomes for communities affected by fragility and conflict.
And Arif, over to you. That question between collaboration between researchers and implementation partners.
I think what we have seen work, especially with CGIAR, is joint priority setting. And basically building these research agendas, if you will, together. And if I could give you one example of that is our project, it's called the NORAD project, basically, which has several case studies in several countries under it. And it is seen as a very successful, large-scale, I think it's over 20 studies initiative. And the reason why it has worked is because of the connection between researchers and WFP staff and governments and others. So the ownership is there. And when I say ownership is there, it doesn't mean that that minimizes the credibility of the research because you have implementers as well as you have the evaluators or assessors or analysts of that. Because the purpose is together to make sure that we are doing the right thing. And with that purpose and being together gives that space where people are not looking for like, oh, whether they were right or whether they were wrong. They're looking for what is the best for the community, what are the best things we need to do out there in the field. I think this has built. Why? Because of the trust, because over time, we are researchers, we are practitioners, but we are also friends with a common purpose and a common goal in that sense. This is something which for me is unique with the CGIAR, and I do value that a lot.
I think in terms of the relationship between a research consortium and field-based practitioners, it's a relationship, it's a collaboration which is not traditional. Like in the past, there'd be a humanitarian response and we'd see refugees coming across and we'd make sure that you get the food, the water, the protection there. But now we're seeing that you can't have a solution to a refugee influx unless you involve development actors, unless you look at climate specialists, unless you look at resilience, unless you look at a whole of society approach. And this is where working with an institution like CGIAR and others is just so critical, because how populations are being displaced now is vastly different to how populations were displaced 10, 15, 20 years ago. Populations are not going home. The areas which they've left have often been impacted not only by conflict, but by environmental degradation and the consequences of the climate crisis. So what I'd be liking to see is an even expanded collaboration. So it's more of a coalition. So we're talking about WFP here, we're talking about UNHCR, we're talking about CGIAR, but there's also relationships with the World Bank, with the International Financial Corporation, with the vertical climate funds, the African Development Bank. So we all need to be working with similar data and evidence. We need to have a common understanding of what are the threats, but also more importantly, what are the opportunities that we need to invest in? How do we do it collectively rather than individually? And so I think having an organization such as CGI, which is really quite big and is located in almost every hotspot in the world, we often don't acknowledge that they are regionally based, provides this anchor for evidence and data to inform almost every humanitarian development peace building initiative that goes out there. So what I would like to be seeing is much more of a common acceptance of the data, the need for science, and have that very much linked in with affected communities. How do we ensure that there is a feedback loop that not only do we have the investment in the data and science, but when you actually have the operations being implemented on the ground, how do the communities feed back into that to ensure that it's calibrated, the empowerment, the overall objectives are being met? So we're on the way, but we haven't got there yet. So we just need to continue with the best practices. We need to be investing in technological support. We need to be making sure that people on the front lines, including the displaced, are included in these discussions, but also most importantly on the decisions, and that we focus on impact. There's still too much talk in all these meetings, but we need to ensure that there is ways in which we can monitor and report back, is the money actually making that difference to the woman on the ground who's trying to get her kids through life?
So Arif and Andrew, by way of wrapping up our conversation, what are your key takeaways or reflections on the future partnerships between CGIAR and the World Food Program and the UN Refugee Agency, respectively? And Arif, we'll start with you to discuss the WFP.
So I have essentially 3 points. One is that many times we are very much focused on finding the solution, which means that we forget to analyze the problem and we don't get the wrong right. So the problem with that is that if you don't get the wrong right, then you're solving something, but it's not the right problem. And I think CGIAR can help us also getting the wrong right. My second thing is that we are sometimes in a situation of we do applied research, right? I mean, that is applied, it's practical, it's right here, it's right now for a purpose right now. And in that type of environment, it is important to know what you're doing in terms of whether you're applying a model to a problem or a problem to a model. And this is critically important because with CGIAR, basically, when the problem is resolved, the model is being applied to the problem, and it's not the other way. The third thing for me going forward is we need to do more research on cost of inaction. We have talked about our financial gaps, we have talked about the suffering of people. Is there a cost of this, and to whom? It's very obvious that if you are suffering, if you are in pain, yes, you are paying the price. But I would like to say is that others within the region, within the continent, outside the continent also pay the price of that. It's just that they pay the price a little bit later. Because we live in a world where actions and reactions are no longer in the same place. Something happens in place X, we feel the pain in place Y. Our research needs to start quantifying that pain in place Y.
And Ismahan, where do you see this research and science agenda going in the coming years?
I think really for us as CGR, we haven't started working on fragile and conflict affected food system throughout our history. It's quite recent for us, but in the coming years, I think really CGR research agenda will increasingly focus on fragile and conflict affected food system due to their unique vulnerabilities and growing population and the growing number of conflicts per se due to either human-made or climate-made conflict. And this will require really targeted innovation and context-specific science. In our new portfolio for 2530, we developed a program that we called Food Frontiers and Security. And we think really this will serve many areas. 5 of them will be very important, I think, going forward. The first one, it's deepening the understanding of how fragility and conflict disrupt the food system, including supply chain and market access. The second one, it's prioritizing resilient strategies. And this could be diversification of livelihood. It could be through enhancing local food production. It could be through empowering local communities. The third point will be focusing on nutrition-sensitive agriculture to improve food availability and nutrition in those conflict zones. The fourth area will be guiding conflict-sensitive agriculture policies and supporting inclusive practices, particularly for women and marginalized groups. And the fifth one, it's really collaborating with a humanitarian organization to integrate agriculture intervention into emergency responses. I think really for us as CGR, as newcomer, but the largest publicly funded international agriculture science institution, we really would like to aim to foster much more resilience and much more sustainable livelihood in the world, most vulnerable regions, and those zones in conflict and also in post-conflict zone are some of the most vulnerable regions and communities we work for.
I wanted to lastly give everyone an opportunity to make concluding remarks, articulating anything they wanted to conclude this conversation with. And Katrina, we can start with you.
As we look to the future of addressing fragility and conflict and forced displacement, I think what has emerged today is that our focus has to be on innovation and on evidence-based solutions. Fragile and conflict affected food systems are not just symptoms of instability, they themselves are integral to rebuilding. And through our research in CGIAR, we are committed to advancing scientific innovations that will address these unique challenges being faced. But we're also committed to working with partners to identify the policies and programming that can improve food security and livelihoods, that will strengthen social cohesion so that we can work toward greater peace for tomorrow. This path forward really involves strengthening and making closer our partnerships with local stakeholders as well as global institutions, and ensuring that our work is grounded in these real-world complexities. We are going to continue producing actionable recommendations that not only inform policies and programming, but can also transform how they are designed and carried out. We hope to align science with the needs of those that are most affected by fragility and create sustainable systems to foster resilience and to mitigate conflict. This is not just our vision, this is truly our responsibility as researchers, as practitioners, and as global citizens.
So, Arif, Katrina just articulated this vision for a path forward in her words. What do you see as some of the next steps for tackling fragility, conflict, and forced migration?
In my head, there are two things which are necessary and they need to go hand in hand. One is obviously if you're in trouble because of violence or conflict or fragility, you need immediate assistance. At the same time, you also know that that immediate assistance is not going to address the root cause of your suffering, whether it be climate, whether it be conflict, or whether it be economic. So this recognition that yes, we need to save lives, but we cannot forget about changing lives. They have to go hand in hand. If you're saving the same life again and again and again, there's something else wrong. And that is kind of the bridge between humanitarian and development. If we don't invest in changing lives, we will continue to be using resources for saving lives, which saves the life, but it doesn't do more than that. And people stay in the rut that they are. And I think this is something, that bridge between changing lives and saving lives, the importance of research in that, and basically showing the decision makers that the returns of investment on that are massively higher compared to what will happen if those problems remain unaddressed.
Andrew, what do you see as next steps?
Well, I think a continuation of how CGIAR has been moving in the last 12 months. We need to be focusing on fragile and conflict-affected states. We need to be focusing on those populations that are most vulnerable. We need to be looking at not so much the past, but the future. We need to be investing in fragile states so they don't become failed states. We also need to be investing in peace because, once you lose peace in such a world at the moment, you're probably not going to regain it. And I'd also back what Arif said before. It's super important that we can actually start monetizing in terms of calculating what peace is worth. And there's always money, well, often there's money, in order to address when there's conflict. But doesn't it make much more sense to invest where there is peace, where there is stability, where the populations are stable, where populations have got access to schools, have got access to healthcare, got access to governance? It's about investing in what works for a community. And so what I hope to see in the future is that we invest in more sustainable programs, that there's less of a focus on only responding to emergencies, that we get the vertical climate funds, the IFIs, to be investing more in fragile states and recognizing that that peace that currently exists cannot be taken for granted. And once it's gone, then it's extremely difficult to get it back. We don't need to have more refugees or displaced people. 120 million people displaced due to conflict is enough. But even this year, we're expecting obviously millions more. We need to be investing in solutions as much as we can. And resources and food are often key to why conflict breaks out. So using this data towards securing peace, valuing peace, getting the resources to where it's required, those countries that are also hosting refugees, is essential.
And Ismahan, over to you to offer some concluding remarks for what, in your view, ought to be some of the next steps to address this agenda.
I think we need more innovation right now. Innovation in terms of technological, but also innovation in the way we partner together. Not only innovation, but also leadership to stop really as many conflicts as we can. But when we can't stop them, then what we need to do is build resilience. We need to build resilience from within those communities. And that's where I see myself really the combination of the cutting edge science, the evidence-based policy, the local knowledge, all of these, if we bring them together in a holistic way, hopefully they will help those fragile regions and those fragile communities not only to survive, but also to rebuild sustainable, productive agriculture system and have a decent life and decent livelihoods. So I think it's about different pieces, bringing them together, and we can't do that without really science and evidence. We can't do that without good faith and good willingness really to work together and to partner together the way we are partnering with UNCHR, WFP, FAO, and other organizations. And local communities. I shouldn't forget local communities.
Thank you, everyone. This was a great conversation and a good kickoff to this series. Thank you all for being here and for your contributions.
Thank
you so much, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.